One of the sad parts of the pandemic were the people who were felt they were forced to uh, or mandated to take a vaccine and then were injured. There are some people who were very happy to go forward and they wanted to protect their loved ones, and inadvertently they may have had an injury. Very often, those people will accept it because that's what they felt was the right thing to do. But for the people who were very hesitant and then became injured, they almost never forgive themselves sometimes because they were concerned in the first place. And what we are talking about today is the fact that we have a very, very important piece of news that is coming out. And that's with regards to in the Daily Mail. They're showing here that this is the 27th of October, 2024, that thousands of Britons are left permanently disabled by the AstraZeneca COVID jab and could get payouts in the overhaul of the compensation system. It's important to note that the primary target in these compensation cases is the AstraZeneca vaccine. And it's not that there are no risks with the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna. It's just that actually they tend to present with different kinds of diseases. And so the more significant diseases, I think certainly the clotting ones tend to be more associated with the AstraZeneca, which didn't have the adjustment to the receptor binding domain where they added two proline residues to reduce the chance of it binding to, I think, other proteins. And this may have had an impact with what happened with the mRNAs. The difference is that with the mRNAs, they bring different kinds of issues. Certainly, IgG4, the production of frame shifting, where they produce abnormal proteins and so on. So each one has their own special, unique kind of characteristics. But in terms of obvious disabilities, it seems that this is far more likely to occur with regards to the AstraZeneca vaccine. One of the important things as well with this here, this is the health secretary in the UK who was talking about reforming the vaccine injury scheme, the compensation scheme. But this is what stands out. More than 15,000 people had applied for compensation for alleged harm, but only 188 have been told that they are entitled to the payout. This is where it gets very, very complex. And it's something that this is just the reality of what happens is that in truth, it's very difficult to categorically prove that the vaccine caused an injury, especially if someone had pre existing issues. That's the truth. And so, if you imagine somebody took the vaccine and then within a week they developed a new complication, an infection, could it have been another medication they were taking? And suddenly it gets very blurred. And this is where it is very, very difficult for people to prove that this was the case. Now, one of the personal cases that was shown was here with regards to this is from, again, the Daily Mail, and this is an article from August of 2024, where a flat race jockey, both him and his wife were 52, and was left hospital bound after three jabs. So it seems she didn't necessarily have significant reactions in the first two, but a very bad one in the third. And she was told that the vaccine would not interfere with her rare autoimmune disorder, this which causes inflammation of the blood vessels. And this is exactly what the spike protein from the virus does. The question is why is it not considered obvious that if the spike protein from the virus can do this, which is inflammation of the blood vessels, why wouldn't you think that this was possible with spike protein from any other source? And in her case, she was denied the compensation, and they didn't think that her problems were related to the jab, but most likely related to her underlying issues. that's very, very difficult for people because it makes them feel they're making up stuff and that they are struggling to put things together. The big question is why is this occurring? And really, how many people can be affected? I want to show you, this is from the UK, and every country will probably have one of these things, which is the UK COVID vaccine injured family. And this is a charity where they have to support each other because nobody seems to support them. They had over 2,000 people involved in this in the UK who have been injured or died in some way, and they're supporting each other through this process. This is real. And so don't let anyone tell you that people are making this up or they're just anti-vax. It makes no sense. They took a vaccine and had a problem. Why would they be anti-vax? It is just a form of gaslighting where you have this awful situation. On one side, you have people who were against the vaccine who criticize them for taking it in the first place. So they don't get any support there. And then on the other side, you have the pro-vax people who say that you're making this up just to support anti-vaxxers. They are left with no support. And on top of that, they don't get any kind of payout for the injuries that they have been afflicted with. You have to remember that I just did a presentation on the first case of long COVID euthanasia in Canada. This is unacceptable that people can be so injured that they choose to die rather than live with the complications that are associated with it. And very few people seem to be trying to even explain what could be the mechanism. Why in the world is it happening? What is going on? And so I think it's important just to give you a simple idea as to what I think really is happening with a lot of people is that there is a what we call a hypermetabolic response in terms of the immune system in some people after vaccination. And they found this in terms of they were doing PET scans and they found that there was different responses after the vaccine in terms of the uptake of fluorodeoxyglucose, which is what is used in PET scans to look for cancer and inflammation. And you can see that some people had mild uptake. This is what it would look like. Some people had moderate uptake in their lymph nodes. Some people had high uptake, and some people had exceptionally high within large lymph nodes. And this was relevant because if you're looking for cancer, the vaccine interferes with this whole process. But what is most relevant about this is the amount of people who were affected. And when you look at gray means that they had no response. Light here, light cream is grade 1. This is grade 2, grade 3, and grade 4. And remember, grade 4 is the large lymph node. And when you look at the responses within just 4 days, you're talking about almost 75% of people had some kind of response. Only 24% didn't have a response. This response gradually came down over 25 days, but even after 25 days, 16% still had a degree of grade 1, 4% still had a degree of grade 3, and 2% still had a degree of grade 4. So you're still talking about up to, this is now 22% of the recipients who are still having an abnormal immune response in relation to the vaccine. My suspicion is this 2% or who are at very high risk for having longer term complications. So this is pretty serious stuff. And this, the fact that it is completely forgotten in the midst of this is even the worst part. And here is part of again the image that I have in my head as to how this works. It's like a Swiss cheese model. If you look at all the injections that people had, a percentage of them will have hypermetabolic lymphadenopathy, which we said was about 16%. Then a number of that 16% will have ongoing spike circulation, And then a few will have the long vaccine pathology. But it's those few, when you have given millions of doses, that's a lot of people. And the point that people miss when they hear about this, they think that it means therefore you should never have used vaccines. No, it's not that. It should have been what they thought at the beginning. Give it to people who were high risk, and I then add, if they had not already been infected. I think that when you understand the autoimmune characteristics around the infection, you should be careful to know that if somebody already had even a mild autoimmune response, triggering it again by an injection is likely to cause them problems down the line. And so, therefore, they should have been very, very specific with who was given the vaccine, and it's what I call targeted vaccination. So it's not that I am anti vax, I am just against the fact that this was used broadly because not enough people understood the autoimmune component of the infection. We're now seeing the outcomes, and we're only starting to see the outcomes because here's the reality of those, say, 15,000 people who applied, you have to then multiply that by 10 or 20 for the other people who may have been injured and didn't either bother to make the application or didn't even make the connection. So they may have become sick within 2 weeks or 3 weeks of being vaccinated and completely forget that this was relevant. Here is a real world scenario that used to happen very often if I was asking patients about whether or not you start with their medication. Say, for instance, you ask them, what's their medication? And then you ask them, did they get any vaccines? And the response was tended to be, I got maybe the flu vaccine. And you go, okay, did you get any other vaccines? And they'd go, no. And I said, did you get the COVID jab? And they go, oh, yes, yes. Oh, yes, the jab. Yeah, 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 I had that. They don't even consider that it is possible for it to be relevant in terms of their presentation. I thought that was dangerous because what you needed was for patients to be vigilant. That's how you identify problems. The only time you don't want patients to be vigilant is if you want to hide problems. But if you want to identify issues, that's what's normally done in research. You want them to be vigilant about everything. Because if there is a pattern that is occurring, you want to identify it early and you want to address it. Anything that is suppressed is going to come back to haunt in the long run. And this is where we are at the moment. Just remember, if there were 15,000 applications, just think how many others were injured and either didn't bother or didn't make the connection. Then you start to see how big the numbers are. And this is why I'm saying the inevitable consequences of this across the population are only just starting to be seen. Autoimmune responses take a while before they present, but I expect to see an avalanche of autoimmune disease over the next 5 to 10 years. The question is it helpful to know ahead of time? Is it helpful to identify the people who may be at risk and potentially try and mitigate some of the complications? Or are we better off just forgetting about it? Let's see what happens and hope for the best, because that's certainly what we're doing now. Luckily for us, the voices of the vaccine injured will remind people that there are real risks out there that may need to be addressed. We can hope for the best, but we should definitely be preparing for the worst. Have a great evening.